this computer. Okay. So, um, okay. So our portion this week is Behar and Bechukotai. It's another combined portion, double portion. Again, because there are more weeks, there are more Torah portions than there are weeks of the year. And when the Jewish year is not a leap year, when we do not add an extra month to the calendar, then most of the doubleable portions are doubled. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So Behar Bechukotai, it's only 3 chapters long, the 2 portions, chapters 25, 26, and 27. And this will conclude the book of Leviticus as well. So this portion, Behar, continues a theme of holiness. And that is that from the portion Kedoshim, chapters 19 and 20, we're told that all the people of Israel are holy. And God set us up as holy, and we have the potential to be holy, and we're commanded to act holy. And then in last week's portion and more, we're told that a subset of the Israelite population, the Kohanim, have to be even holier than the rest of the community of Israel. And this portion, Behar, carries that theme of holiness to the land of Israel itself. And this might be a more spiritually challenging concept to accept, the idea that land can be holy. But maybe it's not so difficult to accept, because we understand, from Native American culture, that there are areas of America that were designated by Native Americans to be holy. And it's not just Native Americans here in this continent, but also the indigenous Australian people, with that that huge rock called Ayers Rock in the middle of Australia itself, as seen as a holy place, a sacred place, which should not be desecrated in any way according to their culture. Same here in this continent, by Native Americans designating certain as burial grounds as holy, but other sites as holy places. So it's an ancient concept that land can be holy. And so therefore, not unusual for the Torah to teach us that a particular piece of land or a territory should be holy too. But it goes to further the idea that we have the people of Israel are a holy people, the land of Israel is a holy land, and together the people of Israel, by following God's holy word, the Torah, so following the Torah, for the people of Israel to follow the Torah in the land of Israel, the holiness of all three are interconnected. It's as I've drawn many times before, there is this triangle that we understand is a basic image of Judaism. I'm just drawing it now, and just putting it with arrows. So we have this image of this triangle that is God on top, interconnected with Israel, interconnected with Torah, and Israel being both the people of Israel and the land of Israel. And so to understand Judaism is to understand the interconnection of these 3 points. And we can't we can't define Judaism without all three aspects. There are Jews today who define themselves without one of the 3 points. In other words, there are humanistic Jews who leave God out of the triangle. There are those Jews who don't see Torah as halacha, Jewish law, as an essential to this diagram. And there are those who would say that the land of Israel isn't essential to this diagram either. But that's the normative traditional understanding, is that it is God, Torah, and Israel being both people and land that are integral to understanding what it means to be Jewish. And so here the book of Leviticus ends with our portion Behar and Bechukotai, reaffirming the idea that the land of Israel is holy, reaffirming the message that was given in the book of Genesis in chapter 12, when God commanded Abraham and Sarah to leave their homeland and make the journey to the land of Canaan, a land that will be promised to Abraham and Sarah and their descendants forever. So we could say that this is kind of a framing of that, or a reaffirming of that image that was given in the book of Genesis, and just reaffirming also that all the books of the Torah are interconnected as well. So that Genesis isn't read just by itself and Leviticus by itself. No, they're interconnected, and we understand that what happens in Leviticus is dependent upon what happened in Genesis too. So let's, I want to read the opening verses of Behar in the Hebrew, and I'll translate it into English, and then I'll talk about this image, this vision that God presents as to how life should be conducted on the Holy Land of Israel. So we're on page 738 in the Eitz Chaim. Whatever edition of Chumash you're using, you're looking for the portion Behar, which is Leviticus chapter 25. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe, God spoke to Moses, Behar Sinai Lemor, at Mount Sinai, saying. So I'm translating it as at. The English says on. Because it would be Al Har Sinai if it was on Mount Sinai, but I think at Mount Sinai is a more accurate translation. There's commentary as to, so what about the rest of the book of Leviticus? Wasn't that given at Mount Sinai too? What's the significance of this being given, saying that this is given at Mount Sinai? In fact, the book of Leviticus began by God calling to Moses at the tent of meeting. So he moved from the tent of meeting, which happens to be at Mount Sinai also. The people haven't moved yet. The entire book of Leviticus, there's no moving happening. From the end of Exodus, when they're building the Mishkan, through Leviticus, they're there at Mount Sinai. So it's just interesting that that we're just told, we're reminded that they're at Mount Sinai. Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the people of Israel, the amarta aleihem, and say to them, Ki tavo'u el haaretz, when you enter the land, asher ani noten lachem, that I am giving you, v'shavta haaretz Shabbat ladonai. The land should rest as a Sabbath to God. Okay, so when we enter the land of Israel, God is saying, the land of Israel needs to have a Shabbat, just like the people of Israel have Shabbat. Okay, Shesh shanim tizra sadecha, 6 years you can put seeds in your field. V'shesh shanim tizmor karmecha, and 6 years you can prune your vineyards. V'asafta et tevuata, and you can gather or harvest its crops, that is the crops of the vineyard and the crops of the field in which you put seeds. Uvashana hashvi'it, and in the seventh year, Shabbaton yihiyeh la'aretz, a Sabbath of Sabbaths there will be for the land. Shabbat l'Adonai, a Sabbath to God. Sadacha lo tizra, don't put seeds in the field. V'charmacha lo tizmor, and you should not prune your vineyard. Okay, so to reflect the concept that the land of Israel is holy, just as the holy people of Israel have a Shabbat every seventh day of in the calendar, and that day is designated as Shabbat to God, so too the holy land of Israel gets a whole year as a Shabbat. So that it makes sense that it doesn't have a week or a month or a day, because the growing cycle is several months long. So it makes sense to have a whole year off if it makes sense from a religious perspective. It happens to make sense from an agricultural perspective too. Agronomists have pointed out the value of, if not letting land lie fallow, at least rotating crops so that the soil itself is not sapped of all its nutrients. And by rotating crops, you're providing different kinds of chemicals into the ground and replenishing it in that way. So agronomists see the value of letting land lie fallow. But again, just as the laws of kashrut, which animals, birds, and fish we eat or don't eat, may be explained by animal scientists as the healthy animals that we're eating, it's not the point. The point isn't to find a logic behind this. The point is to understand what God's purpose here is. And the purpose is to reiterate the idea of holiness and how human beings can experience holiness through the main connections that they have. And for the time that the Torah is being taught 3,000 years ago, most people are farmers, or if they're not farmers, then they raise animals, and those animals that they raise are dependent upon the land as well. So farmers are dependent on the land, ranchers, herders are dependent upon the land, and so to have a spiritual connection to the land, then God is commanding this kind of relationship to emphasize the land is holy. So we're going to keep the land from being worked one year every seventh year. So the verses go on, and then I want to look below the line as to what the commentary has to say about it. Et safiach ketzircha lo tiktsur, you shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest. Ve'et invei nazirecha lo tivtsur, or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. This is in the seventh year. Shenat Shabbaton yihiyeh la'aretz. It is a year of sabbatical for the land, or complete rest for the land. V'hayata Shabbat haaretz lachem la'ochla. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. That is, the land will still produce things on its own without any help from or any human intervention. The fruit trees are going to be bearing fruit, whether people prune the trees or not. And grapes are going to grow, whether you prune the vines or not. So whatever the tree or whatever the land naturally produces, you're allowed to have, but you can't do anything else to the land to increase productivity or anything like that. Um, so you can, whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. Lecha ula'avdecha vela'amatecha, you, your male and female slaves, v'lischircha ulatoshabacha hagarim imach, you, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you. All those people can get access to the produce of the land. V'livhem techa v'lachaya asher ba'artzecha tihiyeh kol tevuata le'achol. And your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. And now it's going to go on now. So seven's an important number in the Torah, of course, right? The seventh day, here, the seventh year. So now the seventh month that we learned in last week's portion, the first day of the seventh month, is a day of shofar blasts. So here, verse 8, V'safarta lecha sheva shabbatot shanim. You shall count off 7 weeks of years. That is 7 cycles of 7. Sheva shanim, sheva pa'amim, 7 times 7 years. V'hayu lecha yemei sheva shabbatot hashanim, tesha v'arba'im shana. So that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Right? So 7 times going through the 7-year cycles, you'll have 49 years altogether. V'ha'avarta shofar tru'a b'chodesh hashvi'i. You shall pass a shofar blast, or you shall sound the shofar loudly in the 7th month. Ba'asur lachodesh, on the 10th of that month, essentially on Yom Kippur. B'yom HaKippurim, on Yom Kippur, ta'aviru shofar b'chol artzachem. You shall have the horn sounded throughout the land. V'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim shana. By doing this, so in the 7th month, in the 49th year, in the 10th day of the 7th month, on Yom Kippur, you blow the shofar, V'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim shana, and that way you dedicate, or that so you sanctify the upcoming 50th year. Ukratem dror ba'aretz, and proclaim release. The Old English would be proclaim liberty ba'aretz, throughout the land. Ulachol yoshveha, and to all the inhabitants thereof. Okay, those of us from Philadelphia, those of us knowing American history, know that that's the line that's on the so-called Liberty Bell, based on this word dror, which is in Old English is translated as liberty, but it's really release, because we'll see, Yovel hi tihiyeh lachem, a jubilee it will be for you. V'shavtem ish el achuzato, every person will return to his land holding. V'ish el mishpachto tashuvu, and every person will go back to his family. So, in other words, the Jubilee year is a time in which, if farmers had mortgaged their land because they had unproductive crops for a while, and they just couldn't afford to live off the land anymore, and the land was more valuable than the crops themselves or the lack thereof, one could mortgage their land, but the mortgage would be dependent upon this 50-year cycle. So if you're in the 5th year of the 50-year cycle and you mortgage your land, you could potentially have a 45-year mortgage on the land, and you'd have pretty good rate from the person you get the mortgage from in order to pay off that loan in 45 years, right? So you could stay on your land that way, but it technically isn't your land anymore because you mortgage it. But the law here says in the 50th year, doesn't matter how many years left you have on your mortgage, the mortgage is released. It comes to an end in that 50th year, and you can go back to your land. So even if you sold your land and you were a tenant farmer on your land, the sale is only temporary. It's only good until the 50th year. So if it's in the 45th year of the 50-year cycle that you have to sell your land, you're going to be there's not going to be any incentive for a person buying the land from you for just to have it for 5 years, because the 50th year is a year in which all the land holdings go back to their original owners. So this applies to when all 12 tribes were living in the land of Israel. It applies to how each tribe got its particular area in the land of Israel to be that tribal settlement, and every family within the tribe had its place in that territory, and therefore that land holding was passed down from one family to the next. And despite how more populous the people of Israel became, there was enough land to go around for all the families. But this system was supposed to have been in place while all 12 tribes were in the land of Israel. So it only works if all 12 tribes are there. So when the Assyrian Empire exiled the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, then this system no longer was in force, because that land didn't belong to Israel anymore. It was Assyrian territory, and then you couldn't do this. Theoretically, the two tribes that were remaining could do this for the rest of the time until the Babylonians came, but ideally it only works when all 12 tribes are there. So this whole system that you have to let your land lie fallow every 7th year is an unusual kind of system for farmers to adopt. I can't imagine yes, so I'm trying to organize my thought. That's why I'm hesitating here. It's one thing if farmers are living in well irrigated and consistently irrigated land, that you can guarantee almost that your crops will be successful in a controlled environment like that, and that you can then budget appropriately so that you have enough in that 7th year when you're not working the land, so that you have 6 years worth of time in a consistently irrigated place to know with 99% assurance that your crops are going to yield the amount that you're planning for. Okay, but we know that crops don't work that way. Even in well irrigated, computerized farming systems, nature will run amok and devastate potentially crops. So that, I don't know, I think I read something this week or last week about the grape harvest in France, and that there was a late cold snap that kind of affected the grapes just a couple of weeks ago in France, so that this year's potential wine harvest is going to be terrible. And so that's, no matter how much vintners can kind of plan, or vintners in California not knowing when forest fires will damage their crops, or hail or tornado or devastating rains in the Midwest can affect crops too. So, commodities futures are a thing when it comes to coffee or oranges, or the wheat harvest or the corn harvest or the soy harvest, etc. it's a big business, the commodities exchange out in Chicago, to understand, what crops will be like. And that's in 2021, when farmers have the most advanced technology available to them in order to budget accordingly. But even then, knowing that they work at the whim of nature. So even more so in the time of the Bible, when the land of Israel didn't have rivers from which you can have irrigation canals be dug to provide water in the dry season. It's not like Egypt, where there were canals that were built off of the Nile River to allow Egypt to have a successful, productive year-round harvest. In Israel, that's not the case. And Israel was dependent upon, and still is dependent upon, rain, which for the Torah comes from God. So the idea here for these farmers to know that they're already dependent upon rain for their success, to then have to give up whatever bountiful harvest, and need to know that they have to budget their harvest accordingly for over the course of 6 years, so that the seventh year their families have enough to eat for that time, and into the eighth year as well, because you only start planting at the beginning of the eighth year, so you don't really see any harvest for a year and a half or so with this system in place. So it makes for a very challenging system, a system that is much more dependent upon the people having faith and trust in God. And so we know from Jewish history, from the rest of the Bible, that the people of Israel didn't really put their trust in God, as we'll see in the commentary below. So let's look below the line on 738 about what this whole system is like and what it meant. At the heart of this parsha is the visionary concept of returning land to its original owner at the end of a 50-year cycle. This prevents the polarization of society into two classes: wealthy, powerful landowners on the one hand, and permanently impoverished people on the other, right? As I said, individual farmers who have a couple of unsuccessful seasons would become poor and would need to sell their land in order to make a living, and then become tenant farmers. So then you would have wealthy landowners taking over the land of Israel, and thereby polarizing society, as the commentary is suggesting. In an agrarian society, a farmer who sold all the land to pay debts had no prospect of ever being anything other than a servant, right? How much can a farmer hope to be able to get back money-wise in order to buy their land back from the landowner that they sold the land to? It would be nearly impossible to, once sold, never get it back. Nor would a servant's sons ever rise above that level, right? Once you're impoverished, it's rare that you would rise above that again. Anticipating the human misery and social instability this would lead to, the Torah provides a plan. In the 50th year, families would reclaim the land they had held originally and later sold. Behind this plan are two religious assumptions. Because all the earth and all of its inhabitants belong to God, human beings cannot possess either the land or the people in perpetuity. Okay? So land and people are holy to God. So therefore, human beings cannot possess God's land, and human beings cannot possess other human beings, which are God's creatures, in perpetuity. We can have control over them for some period of time, but we have to know that it's not forever, because it all belongs to God. And no human being should be condemned to permanent servitude. Some critics have seen this as a utopian plan that never was put into practice, right? How realistic is this plan to make society work? And in fact, it sounds almost like a communist system. There aren't the wealth, there aren't the haves and the have-nots. The entire society is haves, but it's not a wealthy society. You don't have the potential of a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett to emerge in a society like this, because the idea apparently for the Torah is we don't need to be like that. We just need to be able to satisfy the needs of our family, to live knowing that we don't have to live from hand to hand, that we can raise food, or we can provide sustenance for our family. We can make a living. We won't be starving, and we will be able to provide enough for our family to survive. And perhaps there's something to be said that the pursuit of wealth is damaging to human psyche and damaging to society when it pits, when all you're thinking about is the next thing that you can buy, if only you had enough money, right? That's not supposed to be the goal of a religious society. What can I get next? What can I use my money on to access more property that I can, or more wealth? The idea is not to think like that, but to think about just to be satisfied, right? So the statement by the rabbis is Ezehu Ashir, who is a wealthy person, Hasameach Bechelko, one who is happy with what they have. And that's, as we know, in a consumer kind of society that American society is and Western society is, it's not about being sameach bechelko. The goal of a consumer society is never being happy with what you have, because there's always more to have. Okay, so some critics have seen this as a utopian plan that never was put into practice. But archaeologists have found records of deeds from the late biblical period containing references to the number of years remaining until the Jubilee year, right? So the Haftarah for the portion Behar, which we're not going to be chanting this week, because when it's a combined portion, we read the one for Bechukotai, has such a story of Jeremiah being in prison and needing to redeem the land of his cousin. So there are stories in the Bible of this, and we have other records as well. Cook, that is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, taught that the purpose of the Jubilee was primarily spiritual, not economic. It came to restore the sense of unity that once prevailed in Israel, and to restore self-respect to the person who had sunk into poverty and a sense of failure. Right, so there's a more spiritual purpose to this than an economic one. Even as the weekly Shabbat enables people to define themselves in non-economic terms, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee enable an entire society to put aside economic competition and the practice of defining a person's value in economic terms alone. Right, so the 7 also highlights this, 7 being the special number, and as Jan put in a chat to me privately, we're in the Omer period, is 7 weeks, the 49 days, and the 50th between Passover and Shavuot, the 50th day being the holiday of Shavuot too, right? So there are many examples of the number 7 and how holy the number 7 is. Okay, so now I want to read also number 4, which is the very last line on 738. The Holy Land, like the holy people, on to 739, who will inhabit it, needs a Shabbat to replenish itself and bear witness to God's ownership of it. Right, so when we observe Shabbat, we recognize God's sovereignty over time. And when the land observes Shabbat, it reminds us of God's sovereignty over the land. Chapter 26 threatens that if the people Israel do not live by God's ways, the land will be devastated by enemies and make up for its Sabbath years. The prophet Jeremiah predicted 70 years of exile in Babylonia to make up for the 70 sabbatical years the people neglected during their approximately 500 years of living in Israel. There's nothing in the Bible from the end of the Torah through the rest of the Bible that is an observance of the Jubilee year. There's nothing there that says, well, we have instances of the holiday of Passover being observed. We have a reference to the holiday of Sukkot being observed when King Solomon dedicated the temple around the time of the holiday of Sukkot. So we have references to those holidays, but we don't have a reference at all to the Jubilee year as described here being proclaimed. So the rabbis then say, well, then that's why the people of Israel were exiled for 70 years. And it was about 70 years from the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians until the Persians let them back 70 years later. So the 70 years, 1 year of exile for every Jubilee year that was not proclaimed, right? And there should have been, no, that's for every sabbatical year that was not proclaimed. So 70 sabbatical years there should have been in 500 years. So, right, it would have been 10 Jubilee years, etc. So there's nothing that in the Bible about that, which is why the rabbis say that's why we were exiled for that amount of time. Okay. In the time we have left, I want to go on to look at the portion Bechukotai. And here, if we go on to page 747, or it's chapter 26, beginning with verse 3, this is the second of the double portion, and it's the last portion of the book of Leviticus. This is mainly blessings and curses. A short list of blessings, page 747 and 748 are the blessings if we follow the covenant. So in other words, it makes sense to end the book, I mean, just logically in terms of how the book is set up with, if we're supposed to strive for holiness, then if we do so, then these are the blessings that we'll merit. And if we fail to do so on purpose to try to be holy, then these are the curses that will befall us. And so there are a lot more curses than there are blessings listed here. So there's a little bit of commentary about this below the line. This parsha on 747, this parsha centers on a brief but eloquent promise of blessings for those who follow God's ways, and a lengthy and chilling series of curses for those who reject God's ways. The curses are known as the tochecha, or reproach. Several commentators, notably Ibn Ezra, who lived about 900 years ago in Spain, 800, 900 years ago, insist that although more verses are dedicated to the tochecha, right, about 40 verses for that, the blessings promised in the opening section outweigh it in quality. So the quality of the blessings are better than the quality of the curses, but curses still, there's more. The curses are spelled out at length in the hope that they will put fear into the hearts of those who cannot be persuaded to do what is right by any other means. In many synagogues, it's customary to read the tochecha in an undertone, perhaps because its vision of disaster is so frightening, or perhaps in keeping with Leviticus' commitment to the reality of words. To say something aloud is halfway to making it happen, right? The portion Tazria Mitzorah reminds us, according to the rabbis, of what punishment we might, the skin disease, the so-called leprosy, is the punishment for gossip. And so that's words that we say about other people in a disparaging way. And so here, these curses will befall us. I always say it in an undertone because if we said it in regular voice, we might cause it to happen. So the tradition is, and most it's it's mainly Paul who would read this section for us from the Torah scroll, does this in an undertone. The blessings, if we just read some of the blessings, um, right. So let me just read the beginning of the portion in the Hebrew. Im bechukotai telechu, if you follow or you walk in the path of my laws, that's mitzvotai. That's the sense of why it's called halacha. So the term for Jewish law is the same root, lalechet, to walk. So telechu, you would walk or go. Halacha, the act of walking or following. So that's the why it's called halacha. Im bechukotai telechu, if you follow my laws, ben mitzvotai tishmeru, and my commandments you follow, observe, v'asitem otam, and you do them, v'natati gishmechem be'itam, I will give your rain at the right time in their season, v'natna haaretz yivula, and then the land will give forth its produce, ve'etz hasadeh yitain piryo, and the tree of the field would give its fruit. Right, follow my ways. Rain will come at the right time, and the land will give its harvest. V'hisig lachem dayish et batzir, your threshing shall overtake the vintage. Uvatzir yasig et zara, and your vintage shall overtake the sowing. Right, you'll get more than what you plant. V'achaltem lachmachem lasova, you shall eat your fill of bread. V'yashavtem lavetach ba'artzachem, and you shall dwell securely in your land. Right, so there'll be peace in the land. You'll be secure, knowing that you're following God's ways, and therefore everything will fall into place for you. 748, Venatati shalom ba'aretz, I'll grant peace in the land. Ushachavtem ve'ein macharid, you shall lie down untroubled. You won't be trembling like Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. They're the tremblers. So you won't tremble in fear. V'hishbati chaya min haaretz, I'll stop wild, evil animals of prey from roaming the earth. V'cherev lo ta'avor ba'artzachem, there won't be any sword sheathed in your land. Or daftem et oivechem, swords unsheathed, actually. You'll pursue your enemies. V'naflu lifnechem, they'll fall before you. L'charev v'radfu mikem chamisha me'ah, 50 will be able to chase away 100. Ume'ah mikem ravava yirdofu, and 100 can chase away 10,000. V'naflu oivechem lifnechem l'charev, and your enemies will fall before you. Ufaniti alechem v'hifreiti etchem, I'll look with favor upon you and make you fertile. And v'hirbeti etchem pru urvu, I'll make you fertile and multiply. V'akimoti apriti etchem, and I'll fulfill my covenant with you. V'achaltem yashan noshan v'yashan mipnei chadash totziu, you shall eat old grain long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new. You'll have so much harvest, you won't know what to do with them. Okay, so these are the blessings that will befall us. And then I'm not going to read the long list of curses that you can do on your own, but here's the idea that perhaps these people, one sense of why do we have the blessings and curses here in the Torah. If we can imagine the people of Israel as actually children, in their spiritual development, so that they are young in their spiritual development, just as children need to know positive reinforcement and also negative reinforcement for as a matter of discipline, so too this is a spiritual discipline for the religious people of Israel. And though it might be troubling to us to read this as so-called more sophisticated kind of people, now we don't need this kind of threat of punishment hanging over our heads for a spiritually developing people. It might be necessary to have it laid out in such primitive ways as this. And we can also see that in as the rest of the Bible and Jewish history played itself out, the Bible reiterates and emphasizes for us the punishments that are listed here actually happened in Jewish history. That we were vanquished, we were defeated by the enemy, where there were punishments. Just read the book of Lamentations that kind of highlight what would that here the Torah portion would says the graphic, horrific things that might happen to us as punishment, that we become so impoverished that we'll be desperate for what to eat. The book of Lamentations kind of highlights that as it witnesses the destruction of Jerusalem and the impending exile to Babylonia, the horrific events that happened in Jerusalem at that time, 2,500 years ago. So in a sense, the Bible itself emphasizes the blessing and curse lesson that the book of Leviticus lays out here, so that the entire Bible becomes a unified work of religious teaching, so that we understand that all of it is part of the way the history of the Jewish people is all according to God's plan. And that's the message that the book of Leviticus leaves us. So any questions or comments about these portions? So then, yes, Saul.
Okay, so what about the other side of the story? Like the German Jews, they came to America and they became very successful, and they actually employed thousands and thousands of people who were down on their luck, who needed jobs.
Right. Yeah. So Saul, I'm not saying, well, the Torah lays out an ideal society and an ideal system for the land of Israel itself. And it sees that if it would work in the land of Israel, it could work around the world. Well, the rest of the Bible points out how the Jewish people themselves didn't follow through on their own commandments, their own unique laws that were supposed to be observed in the land of Israel itself. How much more so other people weren't following through either. So Jews were very practical people, understanding that we are not from 2,100 years ago until 73 years ago, we were not in charge of our own affairs. And so we were dependent upon the laws of the country that we're living in to fend for ourselves and make whatever livelihood we can. So in some places like America, we were able to take advantage of those laws. And how did those people, the Levi Strausses, the Schiffs, I don't know, I'm just thinking of the courtyard of the Jewish Theological Seminary that has a last name of all the people that gave money to the seminary. Some of those very German Jews that you're talking about, how do you make up for how do you deal with the wealth that you are accruing and become religious in the process, or maintain a sense of religious identity while you are accruing wealth. And that is to be philanthropic, conduct your business in as moral and ethical, not just legal, but as moral and ethical a way as possible, and to be generous with your profits so that you're helping other people. It's nowhere near equivalent to what the Torah is teaching us in this portion, but it's how the Talmud and other Jewish law codes over the centuries were to teaches the alternative economic way that Jews should conduct business. When we're in the land of Israel and we're agrarian society, it should be conducted this way that the Torah is teaching us. When we're not there, and it's not an agrarian society, and it's a consumer or business-oriented society, then we have to come up with the other ways in which we can make society as equitable, as profit-sharing as possible, so that nobody goes hungry. So that's yes. So there's the ideal that the Torah lays out, and then there's the practical of how how it's really functioning in the world today, and how we're trying to bring the Torah into our lives to transform this consumer business-oriented society into an ethical and moral one. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, we'll stop here for today. Hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Stay safe and healthy. And we will see you all. Yes, we have class next Wednesday. So we'll see you all next Wednesday, and have a good rest of the week.
Yashkoach.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Take care.
Take care.
Yashkoach.